All right, I'm not Bergen. Bergen's out of town for a in-depth, intensive 2-week class in Memphis, and he asked me to fill in for him tonight. We're starting a new series on Joshua with a little bit of an interlude of Ruth. And so Bergen did provide this handout that you found down there at the end of the table that gives some ideas about how we want to, some ideas to think about as you're preparing to teach your class this coming week. And this first class is introduction to the whole series, so it's not technically, we're not even getting into chapter 1, chapter 2 specifically, but just kind of trying to kick things off. And so what I thought we would do, we have these notes from Bergen. We'll get to that perhaps a little bit later. I took a look at it. He sent this to me earlier in the week, and I kind of wanted to fill in some things historically and kind of set up the background of what we're going to run into in Joshua. And some of it's covered in what he has provided. We're just going to go a little bit more in depth on that tonight, and and then we'll come back to this maybe toward the end and think about, okay, this is kind of the direction that he suggested that we might take this in our classes. What do we think about that? And maybe we can share some ideas about how we might think about presenting this to our classes in this week. Before we get into that, though, what do you find challenging about teaching Old Testament stories? Or do you find anything challenging about it?
Some of them seem kind of, we use the word bogus, but they're just, to our lifestyle, awkward.
Yeah, so they're really different.
Yeah.
It really does reflect a different culture, a different time, a different, the people who are involved with them have different experiences than we've ever encountered. So they can be kind of bizarre. And sometimes we don't get much of an explanation about the story. And so there's this weird story stuck in the middle of something somewhere where, what's that all about? So sometimes it is a little bit, we run into stuff that's a little bit odd and unfamiliar to us. What else?
I think that for me, it's just unfamiliar. I don't know them as well. I don't know the Old Testament as well.
So that's a challenge in a couple of different ways. I think, tell me if I'm wrong, if you're the one teaching, then you've got some ground to make up, right?
Right.
But if you are also characteristic of the people that you're teaching, they don't know as much about it perhaps either. And that kind of that presents some challenges too, doesn't it?
I think a lot of times, so many people's view of the Old Testament is this view of God as being angry and judgmental and passing judgment, killing people, and they miss the whole part of how many times he forgave and brought people back. And I think that's part of what we miss sometimes in teaching the Old Testament, because it is gruesome. Some of the things you read in there, you think, how could anything like that ever even happen on the face of the earth? And we miss the whole point of
Much less be sanctioned
Jesus,
by
that
holy God.
God was showing his righteousness, but he also clearly showed his grace throughout the Old Testament. We tend to lean too far one way. Because that makes it a challenge. You got to get people to see God as to who he really is.
That's going to be a particular challenge in this class, I think. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at all if those sorts of things come up. We're going to take a look further back before Joshua to kind of lead into it, and some of that's going to be Deuteronomy, where God, through Moses, says some pretty uncomfortable things from our enlightened point of view, perhaps. What else can make it a little bit challenging to teach Old Testament stories?
Keeping all the names straight.
Okay, so all you gotta do is decide on a pronunciation and use it the whole time, and everybody will just think you know what you're talking about. Right? So read everything up front, figure out how you're gonna say it.
You just make somebody in the class read that.
Man, number 3.
You guys have hit on several things that I had thought of as possibilities for why these stories are maybe challenging to teach. We don't have the perspective on the culture, so some of the events, the actual events that occurred and the mindset of the people that we see seem a little bit different. We might not be as familiar with these stories, and the people that we're teaching might not be as familiar with these stories. And so we find ourselves, if we're not careful, we make assumptions about what they know, and we skip something that's kind of important for them to need, that they need to understand before we can really get into what we want to talk about more specifically. And so, on the other hand, I love Old Testament stories. I find them fascinating. I think it's really interesting that, yeah, we have something like Leviticus, where we have law, but it's also embedded in this whole story of the people coming out of Egypt and God trying to create a nation with this unique relationship with him for the purpose of, if we look back at Exodus 19, what were they supposed to do? They were supposed to become a nation of priests to introduce the rest of the world to this God. But we sometimes, I think, because we know a little bit more of the story, we think of them coming out of Egypt as this fully formed nation of people who are already gods. I don't think that's actually true. There are people who are thoroughly Egyptian in many ways, and they keep longing to go back there. We'll actually look at some stuff tonight, I think, where we'll see them talking about that. So God has this challenge of working through Moses and trying to bring these people to an appropriate understanding of who he is and to reshape their thinking, if I can use a word, to kind of introduce this. So let's take a little bit of time to look back and see Joshua in its context. Bergen talks a little bit about this in the notes, some of the history that's behind this, but there's a gentleman who was, I consider him a mentor to me in terms of understanding the Old Testament and thinking about teaching specifically. And he always talked about how he says he learned this from his grandfather. He said, my grandfather was a preacher, and anytime he preached from the Old Testament, he gave about a 20 or 30 second rundown. Remember, God created the world, Adam and Eve, sin, Noah, and he just kind of traces it all down so that people can put the story he's going to talk about right then into the flow of the overall story. And so, for us, we can think back to Genesis, we can think of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 sons. Joseph is one of the favorites, along with Benjamin, because they were children of the favorite wife. The other brothers are jealous. They sell Joseph into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. Eventually, the whole family ends up there. Joseph has a really unique perspective on this, even after his father dies and his brothers are all concerned. Okay, now daddy's gone. What's Joseph going to do to us? He said, no. You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good, that many people would be kept alive. But then we open up in Exodus, right? And there's this new Pharaoh who doesn't remember Joseph or any of that stuff. And they enslaved the Israelites for 400 plus years. They're slaves. Eventually Moses comes along, right? And God empowers him, and through him does all these signs. And eventually they're freed, and they began wandering in the desert. So what do we learn about Israel during that wandering time? Do you remember? I mean, there are a lot of different ways you could go with that, but
You want to know what Israel learned or what we learned from the whole overall
Either
situation?
way.
Because we see God provided for them through the
Okay.
duration of the wandering. That their
and they were
clothes didn't wear
always
out.
super grateful for that, right?
Always, yeah.
Yeah, so God provide, I mean, first of all, the Egyptians decide, wait a second, we just lost our entire workforce. We need to go get them back. Right, so God holds back the waters and they cross on dry ground, then it comes back over and destroys the army. There's a provision. God appears as a pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night, leads them. So there's leadership through all of this. He provides food, manna, quail.
The thing I always notice about that, which I try to relate to my life, is he didn't provide a stockpile for a month or a year. He provided it on a daily basis. Didn't he? Didn't it spoil each day?
Uh-huh.
And
Except for Sabbath, you could collect twice the day before and retain some for the Sabbath, but that was the only time it would work that way.
and so, I mean, that, to me, that relates to his desire for us to seek him and be appreciative to him daily. Just like he talks about taking care of the birds and the flowers. He did that for his people daily then, and he does it for us now.
Yeah, and it's instructive, the response is instructive too, right? Because eventually you start complaining about all this manna and quail. They want some variety. And so they become ungrateful about it. In fact, on multiple occasions in Exodus, we read about them murmuring or grumbling against God. Exodus 15, they murmured about a lack of water. In Exodus 16, they murmured about a lack of food. Exodus 17, they murmured about a lack of water again. When we come to something that Bergen talked about here, when we get to Numbers. and the Lord spoke to Moses, beginning of chapter 13, send men to spy out the land of Canaan. We know how that turned out, right? And they go in there, they find this fantastic land, but big people, scary. So when those spies return, take a look at verse 25 of chapter 13. At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. They came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told them, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. Besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is the land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. And this disheartened the people, right? We go on into chapter 14, and we hear God's response to this. In verse 11, right after they just about come to the point of stoning Joshua and Caleb, who say, no, we can do this. The Lord said, how long will this people despise me, and how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I have done among them? I will strike them with a pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a great nation, or a nation greater and mightier than they. And what's Moses' response to that?
Same thing as last time God said that. The Egyptians will hear of it, and you'll be looked down upon as the true God.
Yeah, and they'll say you couldn't really do what you said you were gonna do. And so Moses pleads on behalf of the people. And the Lord,
Explain that a little more, please, of what he's saying, and you're saying
when
What
Moses
are you saying?
heard God threaten to do away with the people and make of Moses, who's faithful, a great nation. Moses says, wait a minute. If you do that, then the Egyptians are gonna hear about it. And they're gonna think, this mighty God isn't really so mighty after all. He couldn't do what he said he was gonna do. And so you'll look bad,
Okay.
essentially.
Mhm.
You'll look weak. You won't do that. You won't look good to them. And so you're not as great as you said you were.
Gotcha.
And so it'll make
I see it in verse 17, yeah.
At the
Okay.
foot of Mount Sinai, when Moses came down the first time, and they were worshiping the golden calf, God said the same thing. I'm gonna wipe these people out and start over with you. And this is exactly the same thing that Moses said then, almost word for word. So this is twice. Moses had got down from just utterly destroying his people.
So I mentioned a few times that the people had murmured against Moses, which was interpreted as murmuring against God. So after Moses makes this plea, the Lord said, verse 20, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. And none of those who despise me shall see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. Now since the Amalekites and the Canaanites dwell in the valleys, turn tomorrow and set out for the wilderness by the way to the Red Sea. And he continues on, how long shall this wicked congregation grumble against me? I have heard the grumblings of the people of Israel, which they grumble against me. Say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing, I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and all of your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward who have grumbled against me. Not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. So God has promised the land. This goes all the way back to Abraham, right? God promised he would give him the land, that he would make a great nation of his descendants. Here we are. There's a great number of that family now. They're moving in the direction of this promised land. And yet, despite knowing of the 10 signs that God through Moses, performed while in Egypt, they don't trust him. They display a lack of faith in God to deliver on his promises. And so by the end of Numbers, Israel's poised at the east of the Jordan, getting ready to enter the land. And we move on to Deuteronomy, which is, in one sense, the last will and testament of Moses. And it's basically a series of speeches provided and given by Moses. And for very many of those, maybe a recurring idea of a lot of those different speeches is remember the Lord. Know about his power. Think about what you have seen. Go to Deuteronomy 7. Verse 16, and you shall consume all the peoples that the Lord your God will give over to you. Your eye shall not pity them, neither shall you serve their gods, for that would be a snare to you. If you say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispossess them? You shall not be afraid of them, but you shall remember what the Lord your God did to Joseph and to all Egypt. The great trials that your eyes saw, the signs, the wonders, the mighty hand, the outstretched arm by which the Lord your God brought you out. So will the Lord your God do to all the peoples of whom you are afraid. Moreover, the Lord your God will send hornets among them until those who are left and hide themselves from you are destroyed. You shall not be in dread of them, for the Lord your God is in your midst, the great and awesome God. The Lord your God will clear away these nations before you little by little. You may not make an end of them at once, lest the wild beasts grow too numerous for you, but the Lord your God will give them over to you and throw them into great confusion until they are destroyed. And he will give their kings into your hand, and you shall make their name perish from under heaven. No one shall be able to stand against you until you have destroyed them. And yet, Moses feels compelled to say what he says in Deuteronomy 9. Hear, O Israel, you're to cross over the Jordan today, to go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than you, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, whom you know, and of whom you have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak? Know therefore today that he who goes over before you as a consuming fire is the Lord your God. He will destroy them and subdue them before you. So you shall drive them out and make them perish quickly, as the Lord has promised you. Do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you. And that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Know therefore that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness. Are you getting the point?
Where are you at? What
I'm in Deuteronomy chapter 9.
Yeah.
By my count, that's at least the third time in these few verses that he said, it isn't because of you.
Yeah. Wow.
You know, it's not just once, it's not just twice. For you are a stubborn people. Remember and do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness. From the day you came out of the land of Egypt until you came to this place, you have been rebellious against the Lord. Better remember, better know about the power of the Lord. So where do we end up by the end of Deuteronomy? I'll stop talking for just a minute. You guys jump in. By the end of Deuteronomy, what's kind of the key event there at the end, just before Moses dies, at least in the chronology of the story? What stands out in this series of speeches?
Talking about like in the song and the blessing of Moses.
There's definitely
Moses'
good
last
stuff
counsel.
there.
It's always about God and his faithfulness. I mean, it's never been about our ability to do this thing on our own. It gets you into Galatians. But I mean, you go back into Numbers and you get into the story. It's, Balaam and the talking donkey, and this whole conversation is God's up here directing Balaam to actually, instead of curse, he's giving blessing, and they're down in the camp doing what you're talking about earlier, and just grumble, and he's up there blessing them. And that's always been the case, right? And he's saying the same things over and over again. There's consequences for disobedience. Moses is going to stand there and see Jericho, but he can't cross the Jordan. But God's in control. He's got this thing, but we like to grab and take, and that's going to be That's gonna be the first problem on the opposite side. They're gonna go take over Jericho, they're gonna do exactly what God asked them to do, and then they're gonna screw it up. Just like that. So, we like to grab and take, and God needs us to be a little hands off.
So what I had in mind was along the lines of of blessings and curses. That's what stands out to me for the end of Deuteronomy is chapter 28, especially where we hear about these blessings for obedience. We hear about curses for disobedience. We won't necessarily take the time to read all of that. But remember how
I mean, if you
that
look
is the
at Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 1, and 28, verse 15, both of them basically start with the same word. If.
Mm-hmm.
If you will obey, this is what I will do for you. If you don't, this is what I'm going to do to you. And when you look at the don'ts throughout the next 3 or 4 chapters, there's a whole lot more of those that I'm going to do to you if you don't obey. Trying to drive it home, it will not go well for you.
and to your earlier point about the graciousness of God, for how long did he let them remain in the land? Not that they were unpunished entirely. We could get into Judges there, right? We know about that cycle where they obey and things go well, they disobey. God sends somebody to punish them. People cry out to God. He raises up a judge. The judge defeats the foe. The land has rest. But it keeps cycling. And every step in the cycle, it gets actually a little worse. So it's more like a downward spiral. And by the end, they're warring with themselves. A priest has a concubine, and there's really gross stuff that happens. It's the part we don't tell the kids about Joshua, right? I mean, Judges, sorry. But yeah, it's conditional. If. So, obedience entails obedience to the law, avoid idols, which will require driving out the pagan inhabitants and so forth. We could go back to, we already read a little bit from later in chapter 7, but there's a really good section beginning. No, I did read that, sorry. It's all running together for me. But what were they not supposed to, I mean, what were their basic charges when they were to go into the land?
Wipe everybody out, don't become like them.
And that's the gist of it. But it also involved, you shall make no covenants with those people. You shall not intermarry with them. You are to utterly destroy them. What's the first thing they did, even before they actually entered the land, that violates one of those things?
Well, when they went in and made a covenant with the lady that let them out the window,
They made a
they made
covenant.
an agreement with her.
Yeah. They hadn't even crossed over into the land yet. And they make a covenant. Interesting stuff. So, we're right there on the cusp of entering the land. We end up with the blessings and the curses. And in chapter 30, we end up with another speech of Moses that sounds an awful lot like the one that we're familiar with at the end of Joshua, actually. Look at Deuteronomy 30, starting in verse 15. See, I have set before you today life and death, good and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply. and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are inheriting to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away, and if you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring might live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him, for he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give to them. Which sounds an awful lot like what Joshua, I mean, we're familiar with that, right? It's actually the title for this particular week. Choose this day whom you will serve. Joshua gives a very similar speech at the end of Joshua. Choose. You've got it before you. Obey, disobey. What are you going to do? Choose this day whom you will serve. So this is actually one of the first links that we have between Joshua and Deuteronomy. And in fact, Joshua is linked to both Deuteronomy and to Judges, this whole section of Scripture. In fact, is often referred to as the former prophets. And so it's, or the Deuteronomic history. Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses. Joshua begins with after the death of Moses. Joshua ends with the death of Joshua. Judges begins with after the death of Joshua. There are all kinds of other links there. A lot of the material from Joshua 23 and 24 is reiterated in the first chapter of Judges, first 2 or 3 chapters of Judges, where he talks in the speech, and we hear again in Judges, they're not driving out and destroying the inhabitants. They're making covenants with the inhabitants. They're intermarrying with them. All these things lead to them worshiping other gods.
One of the things that's interesting about Joshua that we never talked about is when he was with Moses going into the temple, not the temple, the tabernacle, where God's residing, then Moses will come out and talk to the people. Joshua stays. And it's intriguing because something's going on in there. I mean, God's working with him, teaching him, I don't know.
Yeah.
Certainly saw what his heart was.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't with people, it was with God.
Another thing that kind of links these, both Joshua and Judges together, we talked briefly, just Sarah, for a second about the covenant that they made with Rahab. Rahab was a harlot. How are the people of Israel characterized in the first couple of chapters of Judges? Specifically in chapter 2, talks about them playing the harlot. And he ends with stories about a concubine and kidnapping. We have all those sorts of things that are linked. So, we're ready for Joshua. We can kind of think about the first chapter through 5:12 as being the part about crossing the Jordan, the middle of chapter 5 up to the end of chapter 12 as taking the land. Chapters 13 through 21, really riveting reading. Dividing the land. Which poses, it's an interesting question to me when I think about it. Why so much time on that? It's definitely the most boring part of the book from I'm reading the story. Okay, it really slows down there. We're talking about places. We got all these names of people and descendants and land markers and so forth.
But if your name was in there, that'd be really cool.
That would be really cool.
Or your great-great-granddaddy.
Yeah. And I tend to think of it as something like that, right? It's there for subsequent generations, but the point is not, hey, I'm in the book. It's, hey, look what God did. God said we'd get the land. And here we are, staking our claims to the land.
God has always been a God of order. So it's within his character to make sure he laid it out for them. This is how it's to be divided up. Certainly reduces any arguments. You can't say, but I wanted that. Well, God said you're not getting it.
Of course, there's some other things sprinkled in there that are not quite so positive too, right? We'll get to that here in a few minutes. But then the last three chapters, 22, 23, 24, serving the Lord. A number of years ago, I remember reading about this a little bit and somebody saying that within each of these sections, the verb that I just used, cross, take, divide, and serve, appears within that section, like from 1:1 to 5:12, cross appears, that verb or some form of it appears many more times than you would expect for it to in that part, that length of scripture. Same for the second section, take the land. Same for the third section, divide the land. 22 through 24, serve. And so it seems that there's kind of a thematic thing that's intended there. Remember, a lot of these things were oral before they were written down. And so they're made to be heard. And so you're intended to hear that word being used over and over. And you pick up on that if you're a careful listener. We tend to read, Joshua like it's a history book. And it is, but it's theological history. It's kind of like, to use an example from the New Testament, why do we have 4 different gospel accounts? If God inspired those writings, he inspired them as books, and if he inspired separate books, doesn't it make sense that there is an intent behind each one that might not be exactly the same? In fact, John tells us, right? I didn't tell you everything. If I did that, there aren't enough books in the world to contain all of the things that Jesus began to do and to teach. But I'm telling you these so that you may believe. Right? And so what we get from that is an understanding that these books are put together as selective accounts. We don't really have a lot of information about many of the battles that must have taken place in Joshua. We know an awful lot about 2 of them, though. We know about Jericho and we know about Ai. Or Ai, however you want to say
No,
that.
thank you, no, I, thank you.
All right. I'm valid. Fine. Right? But why is that? I mean, that's one of the questions I think we have to ask ourselves when we're reading. Why is it told this way? Not just what happened, but why is it told this way?
I just did a lesson on Joshua chapter 8, last week in chapel at sunset. And one of the things I brought out that's interesting, in Luke 24, verse 27, Jesus on the road to Emmaus begins to explain to them everything that was written about him and Moses and the prophets. And so that means, why is the Old Testament important? Because it's all about Jesus. So the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that they used in Jesus' time, or Paul would used it. And so it's the Greek Old Testament. The book of Joshua, translated in Greek, the title is Jesus. Jesus. You know, when Philip stops the Ethiopian eunuch and explains to him about Jesus, reading from Isaiah, or when any time the apostles used scripture, they didn't use Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, because they didn't have it. They were referring to Old Testament scriptures. And so when you start thinking about that, well, turn back to the book of Jesus. Let me show you about Jesus when he went to the promised land that God promised his people. You know, preach. And so that one of the things I think why we have Joshua as well as others is we got to start being able to read it between the lines and seeing how Jesus.
Yeah. So when we read these stories, you know, we need to read, we need to know what happened. We need to understand that. But I think it's, if we're gonna try to figure out what their actual intended meaning is, you have to try to figure out why the story is told. Why is it told in this way? And definitely the stories of Jericho and Ai are told against each other. And they're basically commentary on the people and what they did and didn't do, and the different results that were achieved. And the lesson you learn is, you better inquire of God and do what he says. Otherwise, the podunk little town will kick you, and you're gonna lose. So, where does that leave us? Joshua, crossing into the land. It introduced the main themes here in the first 18 verses or so. God is the protagonist. There's this call of Joshua to succeed Moses. Joshua has this role of leading the people to possess the promised land. There's talk of covenant loyalty. How many times in these 2 verses does he say, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous? And there's also the introduction of the idea of rest, which is picked up on in the New Testament and the book of Hebrews, right? Talking about the rest that God provides. And it refers back to this time. We move on into the second section, taking the land, the stories we just were talking about, Jericho and Ai. We have the angel of the Lord appearing to Joshua. Wow, when did somebody appear to another leader of Israel? Wasn't it God in the burning bush with Moses? And there are so many parallels between those 2 stories. We're establishing Joshua as a leader like Moses. We have the whole story about the Jericho's devotion to destruction and the commitment to the ban. Kind of need to read the story of Achan. Against that story of Rahab. Achan and his family lose all inheritance in the land, while Rahab, what does she get? So she gains an inheritance, and lo and behold, whose lineage is she in?
Jesus.
Jesus.
Mother Boaz.
And so, and here we have a situation where Rahab comes in and becomes a part of the people of Israel when they violated what God told them to do when they entered the land. Don't you make a covenant with the people there. They make a covenant with her. And yet, what does God do with it? She's incorporated into the land and eventually is in the lineage of Jesus.
I will also defend her because she had more faith than probably even the spies.
Oh, the problem isn't her.
Yeah.
The problem is what the spies did.
Yeah.
What book and chapter and verses is the story of this lady you're talking about?
Rahab is in Joshua chapter 2.
Okay.
And then we'll find her listed again in the lineage of Boaz and Ruth when we get there. And we'll find her in the lineage of Jesus in the gospel. So they do a covenant renewal, but then the Gibeonites show up, right? We come from a long way off. We're not part of this land. Let's make a treaty. Okay, sounds good to us. And where are they?
Right next door.
They're right next door, and the phrase that comes up and often through Joshua is, and their descendants are there to this day. And that's true not only of the ones that they made a covenant with, but of a lot of the other people that they were supposed to utterly destroy. Right, so even as they're supposed to be taking the land, they're not fulfilling what God told them to do already.
Out of curiosity, because I've heard this before, how much is metaphorical, how much is, because there's a phrase in there somewhere, totally destroy the Canaanites and then don't intermarry with them. Well, which one is it? I mean, or is it a prophecy that you know you're not going to kill them all? Like, what's the,
That's the way I would interpret it.
or is it metaphorical as like, you know, we're totally going to annihilate that team we play on Saturday, you know, whatever. Well, it doesn't mean you're going to totally kill them all. You hope to just win the game, you know. And I'm really curious. I've heard both, but
I believe it's literal. Kill them all.
If you kill them all, you wouldn't have to worry about intermarrying. But just in case you don't listen to me, then at least don't do this part.
The instruction's not much different than when Saul was told to go and kill whichever kites it was, the Amalekites.
Amalekites.
Yeah. And then they kept the king alive. Some of the
And the best of them.
best of the livestock and all that, which was not his order.
We're gonna honor it. I mean, we're gonna offer it and sacrifice.
Which as much as we agree with.
And so, you know, one of the things that begins to pop up here is, you know, throughout this is we're gonna see evidence of them obeying and evidence of them disobeying. And it's setting the stage for the rest of the story that we read throughout the rest of the Old Testament. And back to your point one more time, how patient God was with them. You know, when I read Deuteronomy 28 and see blessings and curses, it sure sounds like, and the second you do something wrong, it's over.
What Moses had said, they should never have taken possession of the land. It should have been wiped out before it ever was completed.
We're talking several hundred years.
Oh, yeah.
Before the final fall of Jerusalem in 586. A minimum of 700 years.
And even then, a remnant remained.
So divide the fulfillment of the promise of Abraham, the promise to Abraham, chapters 13 through 21. They're focusing on the placement of and the space allotted to all the tribes. But it also begins with a reminder of what still remained to be done. Take a look at the first 7 verses of chapter 13. In fact, my Bible has a really helpful subheading: land still to be conquered. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years. So this isn't 3 weeks after they crossed into the land. It's been a good while. And the Lord said to him, "You're old and advanced in years, and there remains yet very much land to possess." And you can read for the next several verses about all the area that had yet to be taken. And so the Lord says, "Now therefore divide this land for an inheritance to the 9 tribes and half tribe of Manasseh, and get after it." So there are tribal provisions that are made in chapter 14. Caleb, we find out specifically about his inheritance. He's of the tribe of Judah. We hear about the second group is Joseph's sons in chapters 16 and 17. It's a little bit of a break right at the beginning of 18. About the tent of meeting. Another transition to the 7 other tribes whose inheritance had not yet been apportioned. So then we run down through the rest of that, beginning with Benjamin and closing with Joshua, who is of the tribe of Ephraim. And so this whole section is bookended by Caleb and Joshua, who are from basically the two most prominent tribes, at least later in Israel's history. Then we get into the serve section. Basically, go ahead.
Before you get there, I always point out whenever I teach this, Joshua 21 verse 43. I think it's very significant to just state it so people can hear it. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their forefathers, and they took possession. He fulfilled his promise.
So
It's not like we're still waiting today for him to give Israel back what he promised to give Abraham. He fulfilled it in Joshua's time,
That was 21, what?
43.
and that's why I think the whole 13 through 21 is there. Like I've said, it doesn't make for the most exciting reading, but it culminates with, in this case, we get our secret decoder ring straight in the text, right? It says, thus, God gave them everything. He did exactly what he said he was going to do. So if we're going to talk about fault with the covenant, it's not that God didn't hold up his end of the bargain. He's done it. Now it's up to the people. Are they going to fulfill their end of the bargain? So then we have chapter 22 that basically almost have civil war. 23, Joshua talks to the leaders of all Israel, elders. He talks to all the tribes of Israel in chapter 24. And that's where we get the choose you this day whom you will serve. The people say, oh, we're going to do it. Which makes me remember what they said earlier. Just as we obeyed Moses, so we're going to obey you. And I'm thinking,
Please don't.
please don't. Can't you aim a little higher? All that grumbling and so forth. I still remember all of that. So let's take just a quick spin through Bergen's notes. He's wanting to set the stage for this, for the theme of this whole class, this series of lessons through Joshua and Ruth, being about choosing whose are you going to be? Who are you going to follow? And so he's given some questions at the beginning to suggest ways we might want to open a class about this. How do we make choices in our lives? How do we choose who we're going to follow? He goes back and goes through a lot of the same stuff that we did, talking about the promised land, the Exodus, the spies, and so forth, and ending up with Moses' charge to the people, which includes that section that we read, the speech that sounds an awful lot like what Joshua gives at the end of Joshua. Moses gives a charge to Joshua. And those are some of Bergen's suggestions about how to begin talking about this. Anything else? We have maybe 5 minutes or so. Any ideas about how you think you might approach this in talking with your classes?
I think it's important to set the tone. That's kind of what we did today. I think you have to, going back to what Michael said, I think there's a whole lot that we take for granted that either we or the people we're teaching know. I think it's important to be able to go back through it. I was writing stuff down. It's like, who is Moses? Why is he important?
Yeah, I even did that in this class too, right?
Yeah.
I just assumed everybody knows exactly who Moses is.
But like, who is he? And why do we care that he's died? Like, what does that matter in the story that we're sitting here and, what did he do? And then kind of work backwards through Deuteronomy and talk about who Moses is. And then, then maybe you start to skip a few years, but, get back to creation and, kind of tell the story in reverse. But they're sitting outside the promised land for a reason. And it is about choice. They made choices and they were poor ones. But how do we get, I think one is biblical knowledge. We got to help increase that, but also just, I think it's important to set the stage and set the story, because Jesus and Joshua are very tied together.
To your point about everything in the Old Testament points to Jesus. It was written about Jesus. When I first heard that some years ago, it makes the Old Testament make more sense to me. It puts into perspective and it gives me focus. And so I think if you have that in mind, this is all pointing to Jesus. It helps for a better understanding.
Yeah, this is, I mean, it's a book in the sense that it's between two covers.
Right.
But we talk about the parts within it as books. But there really is a story that begins at the beginning of this and goes as far as it goes. I mean, and you could even say in Revelation is talking about the very end, where we're, what our lives need to be in order for that ending to be a good one for us.
Where we get to eat from the tree of life.
Yeah.
They got kicked out of the garden in Genesis 3.
So we have this overarching story, and one of the dangers that we can fall into is focusing so much on any individual part that we happen to be examining right now that we lose the big picture of the overarching story. And so we have an opportunity, perhaps with going to the Old Testament and understanding that perhaps the people in our classes are less familiar with that than they are with the story of Jesus and the letters of Paul. And we have this chance to say, okay, here's how God did things. This is, and we're at this stage, and we just came out of Galatians, right? I mean, he's talking about the law here. The law has been given. We just came out of Galatians talking about how one of the primary purposes of the law was to show us that we couldn't do the law, that we need something that we can't provide for ourselves. Faith in Jesus.
Some fun stuff too. It's like the first generation came out of the Red Sea, got part of the sea, they walked through the waters. And now this new generation is going to pass through the waters to get into the promised land. And who's going to lead them?
How do we get into the promised land?
Follow Jesus through the waters.
All right.
What a coincidence. Yeah.
It's interesting, the Bible